Pat Lowery has a passion for local history, and she cites Lintonville as her favourite building in Newcastle. She's been a volunteer city guide for more than 30 years and has planned routes for the Lintonville's Behind the Books tour, which we hope to start again in July, and has also devised the always popular, always sold out Ghostly Lintonville tours, which we hope to start again in the autumn. Pat is a trustee of the Lintonville and she chairs the Volunteers Committee. Please welcome Pat Lowery and some ghostly and grisly tales. Thank you, Pat.
Wow. Welcome to this ghostly and grisly tales talk. Usually I do this as a tour, and before the tour I always ask people, or even I've done it at talks when I'm doing them in person, if anybody here has seen or heard a ghost in their where they live. And of course, nobody ever admits to it. But usually at the end, one or two people sidle up to me secretly and they'll say, well, actually, there's a ghost in my house. So that is the start. So I'm going to ask the question and you can think about it. Have any of you seen a ghost? Have any of you experienced anything in your home or your working life? And then if you do, then perhaps you could share it with us at the end. This talk really talks about Newcastle and a little bit about Gateshead as well, because of some of the ghosts. You can imagine, because we're over 2,000 years old and some of the buildings are old, there are lots of ghostly tales to be told. But I think one of the most ghostly places is this. This is the Old George, just off the cloth market. The building itself is about 1690, but we think it was built on an earlier site. There was a pub on here, probably from the end of the 16th century. And it's built on what's called a burgage plot. It's a piece of land, and this is out at the back. It's probably on the garden of a building that was on the front. Unlike some of the other entrances off the cloth market, this is quite wide. This is because it was a coaching inn and it had to be wide enough to get a coach down here. But there is a ghost in here. It's a ghost of King Charles I. When King Charles I was held prisoner, and this was in the middle of the 17th century, it was probably in the early building to this, he was allowed out. He wasn't prisoner as we know it. He wasn't in a prison. He was just under house arrest. But he was allowed out. He was allowed to go to Shield to play golf. And this is the first evidence that golf was played in England. He went down to St. Nicholas to pray, and he was allowed to come here to the Old George for a drink, but he didn't care for it very much, because there is a letter in existence which he sent down to London saying, please could you send me up some of my favourite wines, because I certainly don't like what is served me up here in Newcastle. Now, inside the Old George, there's this chair. This is a replica of the chair. This is called Charlie's chair. And the original was, and it said that this is where he sat. Now, during the 1970s, the chair was in such a bad state of repair that it had to be sent away to be mended. And this is when all of the ghostly things happened. The staff would come in and they'd find things like the clock on the wall would fly across onto the floor. And the days when you used to sell cigarettes, they used to be behind the bar. One day they went in, the cigarettes was just scattered all over. And they thought this was Charles. He was upset because his chair wasn't there. It was being repaired. And all of it stopped when his chair came back. So he was pleased to have his chair back in its usual place. But as I say, this is a replica. And if you go into the Old George, you can actually see it and sit on it. Another ghostly building is this one. This is the Cooperage. The ground floor is medieval. The upper floors are a little bit later, 16th and 17th century. It's called the Cooperage because until the 1970s, it was a cooperage. It was a place where barrels were made by a company called Arthur's Cooperage. They eventually moved out then in the 1970s, and it was converted into a pub and a restaurant. And the staff said that lots of strange, interesting things happened. Oh, scary things happened, mainly when they were locking up and tidying up the restaurant. One waitress, she said she looked up and saw a ball of smoke coming towards her. And then another night, this ball of smoke formed itself into a fist and an arm. And she screamed and she fainted. The staff came running and that all disappeared. A young girl dressed in Victorian clothes is often seen walking into the ladies' toilets. And if you go after her, she disappears. There's also the ghost of a gentleman who doffs his cap to the ladies. I don't think gentlemen doff their caps anymore to anybody, but there's some of the ghosts that are seen. The Cooperage at the minute, of course, is closed. It's got scaffolding up at the front. We don't really know what's happening with it. But I expect the ghosts are having free reign because that's what they like. They like it. And I think there are lots of ghosts, especially on the quayside, which are coming out because for years, these buildings have been empty and they've had a great time on their own, but now they've got people to contend with, and I don't think they care for it very much. Now, another very ghostly building is the castle. This is an old depiction of the castle keep before it had its crenellations on the top, and this is more or less how we see it today. Often you can stay overnight in the castle keep, and it's a place which is extremely haunted, and they have these overnight sittings where you can go and pay. I mean, you'd have to pay me, I think, to go and stay there. And there was one occasion when one of the people who were there having an overnight sitting was wandering around taking photographs, and when they loaded the photograph onto their computer, they discovered that there was a rather ghostly image, and this is it. It's about 4 foot high, coming out of a wall. It's one of the passages on the upper floors of the castle keep. There's no doors, no windows, but it looks like there's this ghostly image coming out of the wall. And this is the best depiction we've got of a ghost in the castle keep. Now, this lady, this isn't a ghostly story, this is a grisly story. This is a drawing of a lady called Jane Jemison. Jane Jemison was not a very attractive lady who used to sell oranges and her body down at the Sandgate area of Newcastle. She liked to drink, and she and her boyfriend, William Ellison, were out drinking one New Year's Day. They were celebrating the holidays, and they ran out of money. So she says, well, look, I think I'll go and see my mum and see if my mum can give me some money for some more drink. Her mum lived here. She lived in the Kielman's Hospital. This is a drawing of it as it was, built in the early 1700s. And it was for the Kielman. The Kielman themselves built it. They raised about £2,000. And it was really sheltered accommodation because the Kielman were worn out at the age of 40. So they needed somewhere to stay. And Jane's mother lived on the ground floor. Here's another picture of it. Her mother lived on the ground floor. So she went in, asked her mother whether she could give us some money. And her mother says, no, you've had enough to drink. Get yourself away home, Jane. There was an argument, and Jane picked the poker out of the fire and stabbed her mother through the heart. She lay dying for a few days, and she, even though she said it was Jane, they didn't believe her. First of all, Jane said no, her mother fell on the poker by accident, and then she said no, it wasn't me, it was the boyfriend, he did it. But the neighbours all heard the fight and the argument, and they said no, it was Jane. Jane was arrested, and she was taken on a horse and cart up to the town moor, to Gallows Hall, where she was hanged. And she was the last woman to be publicly hanged on the town moor, which was where all of the public hangings used to be. This is St Mary's Church in Gateshead. And I'm going to tell you the story of the Gateshead Witch. In the 1649, there was witch fever was just rife across Europe. And witches, there were about 3 witches, according to parish records, were tried here in Gateshead. They were tried in a private house and taken down to Durham to be tried, where they were found guilty. And one of them was brought back because it's in St Mary's parish records that she's actually buried here in Gateshead, but she wasn't buried inside the churchyard. She was buried outside in unconsecrated ground. And this bit of here where the trees are in between St Mary's and the lovely music venue next door. And if you look where these trees are, the archaeologists did a dig, and they found the body of a young girl. They took the body away. Here it is. This is it here. She's buried not in a Christian manner. She was buried north-south instead of east to west. They know it was a girl. They know the date. It was about 1649. And we think this is the body of the Gateshead Witch. 6pence was paid for the burial of the witch. And as I say, she was buried in unconsecrated land outside the graveyard of St Mary's. So she's not there now. We thought for a while that she was still there under the trees, but she isn't. She was taken up and she's in a university somewhere down in the Midlands. Don't know exactly where she went, but she has been taken up from the ground. This is a shop on Granger Street called the Travelling Man. I don't know whether you've passed it or not even been in there. They sell sort of American comics. I don't mean the Dandy and the Beano. Different types of comics are here. But it hasn't always been a shop selling this sort of comics. It was a photographer's studio. It was Dickinson's photographer's studio. And in 1889, a gentleman called Mr. Thompson, he went in on the 6th of December, 1889, to have his photograph taken. You could choose what sort of background you wanted, whether you wanted to be outside, it looked like you were outside in the countryside, or inside, whether you were standing or sitting, and he decided to have an inside scene, him sitting on a chair. They took his photograph and he went away. And over Christmas that year, because this was 6th of December, the shop was closed, and it was closed for a whole 2 weeks. And on the 3rd of January, it reopened. And when Mr. Dickinson, the photographer, came to open the shop at 9 o'clock on the 3rd of January, he found a man standing on his doorstep waiting to get in. So he invited him in. He says, right, yes, what can I do for you? He says, look, he says, I've had my photograph taken on the 6th of December and I haven't had them back. And Mr. Dickinson apologised, and I am really, really sorry. But he says, we've been closed. He says, but what I'll do is I'll make sure I have them printed off for you today if you'd like to come back. Mr. Thompson was very angry. And he said, no, he said, I've been walking all night. I'm extremely tired, so I can't come back today. And he left the shop. That was on the 3rd of January. A few days later, on the 6th of January, Mr. Thompson's father came into the shop and he says, I've come to pick my son's photographs up. And Mr. Dickinson says, oh, yes, who is it? Mr. Thompson. Oh, yes, I remember him. He was here on the 3rd of January. He came for him. He says, oh, he couldn't possibly have been on the 3rd of January. He says, because, he says, he's dead. He died on the 3rd of January. And Mr. Dickinson says, well, I did thought it was a bit strange. He looked a bit peaky when he came in. And I says, he did say he'd been walking all night and he was very tired. And the father says, walking all night, he only lives in Jarrow. And he says, and for the previous day, on the 2nd of January, he was delirious and he was, in a coma. So who was the person? Well, it was thought at that time that he was a what's called a doppelganger. And it's thought that if you know you're dying and you try to get all your unfinished business done, and this was Mr. Thompson's last bit of unfinished business. And because when he was delirious, he kept shouting for his photographs, which he didn't have. So this could have been this doppelganger who he'd sent to pick them up. So that's a rather strange story that actually happened at Dickinson's photographic studio. Now, the quayside in Newcastle, this is a drawing which shows as it was. And if you notice, there's no fence, you could easily fall in. And lots of ships are tied up, and they would have had ropes being tied up to the quayside. Very easy for you to trip over and fall in, especially if you'd had a drink. Well, there used to be about 34 inns and taverns on the quayside at Newcastle. So if you came out of there one night, it's very dark, no lights, very easy to trip over a rope and fall into the river. And if there was nobody about and you were too drunk, you would probably drown. So this was a common problem. And the council then employed a man, especially to pick up all the dead bodies in the Tyne. At one time, they used to get about one body a week out of the River Tyne. And this man's name was Cuckoo Jack, rather a strange name. It's because his father used to make cuckoo clocks. His father wanted him to go into the family business. But he said, no, he could make more money getting the bodies out of the river because he was paid between 10 and 15 shillings per body, dependent on the size of the body and whether it was male or female. And that's what he would be paid by the council. He was a very, very dour man. He had a sort of like a miserable face, and he had a song written about him, and he said that his face didn't know how to laugh. But he had to get up very early in the morning, he said, to catch the neat's corpses. And he was often seen poling around the river. And because he liked to eat, he used to have his breakfast before he went to bed the night before. So what did he do with the bodies? Well, if he saw there was one instance when he was out looking for bodies in his little boat, and he was rowing up and down the Tyne, and he saw a man in difficulty. He was he was drowning, so he thought he'd go over and rescue him, and he says, oh, I think I better hold on here, I'm going to do myself out of 15 shillings. So he waited for him to drown, then he went to pick the body up and put it into his boat. From there, he took the bodies down to this place. This is the dead house. This is down near the Eusburn, right next to the police station. There's more than one dead house. There was another one behind it. And this is where all of the bodies were taken that were fished out of the River Tyne, and they were placed here. That's right up until 1910, when we had a new dead house, but it wasn't a dead house, and that's this one. This started out as a toll house where people would have to pay a toll if they were bringing goods into Newcastle to be sold. So this was on the end of the bridge. It's now on the end of the swing bridge, but it was built there before the swing bridge was open. It was on the Georgian Bridge, and it was there that you came, and if you were bringing, say, a load of potatoes in to sell, you would have to pay twopence, or half a ton of cheese was about 4p. This was a tax on goods that were brought in. People didn't like it very much. And this tax was abolished in 1910, and this was turned into a coroner's court and a mortuary for all of the bodies that got out of the Tyne. Now, it's a 3-story building because there's another story underneath, and it's down underneath, and there's a little door, and the little door is still there now, where you could go straight in. They built a room with all white tiled walls, and there was a slab for you to place the body on. The person who looked after this was the person who was worked for the the Guildhall, and she lived there. And I was talking to her family, the lady who looked after all of the dead bodies that got out at the time, and she said that this is going back really even as far as the 1950s. She said her mother had to go up to town, and she asked her daughter, she says, look, we've got the electric man to come in to read the meter in the old toll house, in the old mortuary. And she's told me that, she says, do you think you could let him in? And the daughter says, no problem. She'd done it many times before. So the man came, and she says, right, I'm going to let you in to read the meter here. She says, I've got to warn you, she says, that there's a dead body in there. We've got somebody lying on the slab. And the electric meter reader said, oh, don't worry, says, I've seen lots of things in my job. Anyway, in they went, and he fainted at the sight of this bloated body, which had been in the Tyne for several weeks, which was lying, and he fainted on the floor. It's no longer used as a mortuary. It moved. They moved out in the 1970s. And it became, when the coroner's court moved out, moved into Bolbeck Hall, and it became then a place for, but if you didn't have access to NHS facilities, such as if you didn't have a doctor, say you were a social unfortunate, one of the down and outs that were on the street, you could go here. There'd be a doctor, there was a medical social worker, you could have a bath. Local churches used to donate things like soap and shaving gear. And then they moved to Byker from here and became the Elizabeth Street Medical Centre. And they've developed leaps and bounds when they were in Byker. They've built a whole new block down on the Eusburn for people to live in. They've altered what used to be Bevan's department store for some of the homeless when they're, to give them a new start in life. And today it's still owned. It's still not owned, but I think it's leased by what used to be called the Cyrenians, and I think they use it now as a recovery centre for people who were recovering from drink and drugs. Now, there is a story, this is a true story, that there was a gentleman in Gateshead, lost his 2 sons at sea, was absolutely appalled by the amount of bodies that got out of the River Tyne that didn't have any identification. And because they had no identification, it meant that there was nobody to pay for a funeral. So they would just have like a pauper's burial. And he thought it was really bad. So he set up a charity, and he said if any bodies that they got out of the Tyne had no identification, he would pay a reward of 10 shillings. And then he would give that person a proper Christian burial. Well, Charles Dickens came to Newcastle several times. He wandered the streets, he listened to people, he listened to stories, and he heard this story, and he wrote it down in a book, and he used it in one of his books, and that's Our Mutual Friend. So if you've read Our Mutual Friend, the story about the bodies and got out of the river, well, that came from a true story from Gateshead. Big Market, one of the busiest parts of town. Still busy now, but not so much a market, but it is lots of pubs. Wherever there were markets, there were always pubs, considerable number of pubs in the Big Market. And this is a story of a man called Ewan Mcdonald. He was a Scottish soldier, and he was in town, and he was in Pinkney's Ale Tavern having something to eat. He was having a pie, probably, and he had his knife and fork, and he got into a row with one of the locals. This row quickly spilled out into the Big Market when they were fighting, and unfortunately still had his knife in his hand, and he stabbed this person to death. He was arrested, and he was then found guilty of murder, and he was taken up to the town moor to be hanged. Now, this was 1752, and in 1752, an Act of Parliament was passed, saying any hanged murderers' bodies could be handed over to the barber surgeons. Now, surgeons were the lowest grade of doctor. There were 3 grades. There were physicians, there were general practitioners, and surgeons. And the only way a surgeon could learn his craft, or his trade as it was then, was by dissecting dead bodies, very few and far between. Hence all the stories about Birkenhair and body snatching. And tried to rectify this a bit. That this act was said that hanged murderers' bodies could be handed over to the barber surgeons so that they could practice. Which he did. His body was sent over. It was laid out on a slab. This is the barber surgeons. It used to stand next to the Holy Jesus Hospital on City Road. It was pulled down for the building of a railway bridge. And they were absolutely delighted to get this body. And was one night, the body was laid out. They were going to do the dissection the next day. And they left one young student in charge, and he was getting everything ready, making sure all of the equipment was ready. There was the body lying on the slab, and he heard a noise, and he looked up, and Ewan Mcdonald sat up. He wasn't dead. He'd obviously just been unconscious, and they thought he was dead. So he didn't know what to do. He thought, oh, good heavens. He says, if I let him go, another barber surgeons would get him in another part of the country. And that meant that this body would be lost to Newcastle. He says, we couldn't be having that. So he picks up a mallet, hit him over the head and killed him. Well, you cannot be charged for killing somebody who was supposedly already dead. But that wasn't the end of the story, because he bragged about it. He was delighted. He'd saved this body for Newcastle. He told his friends, his colleagues, his family, you name it. And one night when he was coming out of the barber surgeons, he heard the sound of a clip-clop of hooves of a horse. And the horse was coming up the road. And then all of a sudden it started to gallop. And it knocked this young trainee surgeon or student and killed him. People in this area were extremely superstitious, and they all thought it was the spirit of Ewan had gotten to the horse, and it was wreaking its revenge on this young student who stopped him from living a life by killing him with a mallet. Now, the Turf Hotel was, I suppose, the best-known coaching inn in Newcastle. It was run by a Mr. Loftus. Now, you may have heard the name Loftus before, because his grandson gave his name to the Loftus Room in the Lintonville. It was called the Turf Hotel because the grandfather, Mr. Loftus, was also clerk of the races. This is when Newcastle races were on the town moor before they moved to Gosford Park, and he lived in the grandstand, and so did his grandson, and that's why it was called the Royal Turf Hotel. It was he ran coaches from here to 9 different destinations: London, Leeds, Edinburgh, across to Carlisle, but they only ran from Monday to Saturday. So if you missed the Saturday coach and you had a parcel you wanted to send, it would be placed in a little room in the Turf Hotel, and they would wait till the Monday when the coaches would resume again. One Monday morning, the staff went in and there was the most peculiar smell. So they thought, where's this come from? So they investigated, and there was this long, thin parcel, which they decided to open up. And when they opened up, it was the body of a young girl destined for Edinburgh, for the University at Edinburgh. So she was part of the body trade. It was thought that Birkenhair were up in the northeast, trying to plan routes to get bodies up to the Edinburgh University. She was then given a burial, but wasn't in Newcastle itself, not in the centre. It was down in Newsburn in the Ballast Hills burial ground. This is the most least expensive burial ground as it was in Newcastle. But ever since then, they were very wary about long, thin boxes that were left overnight or that were sent on that coach, especially if they had an address for Edinburgh. This is, you probably don't recognise this, but this is the Guildhall. This is the Guildhall as it was built in 1655. It's been altered considerably. The staircase you see in the tower has been taken away. This is how it looks. This is how it looks today. Actually, I was in there this morning and got invited to have a look around the Hard Rock Cafe. The Hard Rock Cafe has taken over the ground floor here. And we went in to have a look and quite impressed with it. I'm not sure if I like Hard Rock Cafe food, but they seem to have spent a lot of money and a lot of time on this building. In 2005, the Tourist Information Centre moved in. And this was a time during it was prior to the Tall Ships Race, and they wanted a tourist information presence on the quayside because they were expecting lots of visitors. And so they did. They altered it, the downstairs. And this is how it looked. This was tourist information as it was down in the Guildhall. They made a really good job of it. But soon after they moved in, there was rather strange things happened. It was mainly if the staff were working late or the cleaners were in. They felt things like the hair. Somebody was tugging their hair or putting hands on their shoulders. And so they thought, what on earth's happening here? So the manager there, she decided to get in an organisation called Otherworld Northeast, to a diagnostic, paranormal organisation, to do an overnight sitting. A couple of members of staff stayed. They came in with all of their equipment. They had cameras, they had lighting, they had temperatures for fluctuation of temperatures. And they set it all up looking for anything that was unusual about the building. They also brought with them a couple of sensitives. And these were mediums or etc. who were sensitive to any paranormal activity. The gentleman who called Mr. Liddell, who ran Otherworld Northeast, told me once, he said this was the scariest place he'd ever been in. He said that one of the places, which was the old kitchen, he set everything up, and he usually, before he started to film or record anything, he said, if there's anybody there, please show yourself. Just then, the old dishwasher started to shake and jumped 2 centimetres. He said he was absolutely terrified. Now, one of my guiding friends called Anne used to work here. She used to work in tourist information. She said that one day she had to go down into the basement part to stock up on some of the leaflets that they kept in the tourist information office. You opened a door, went down some stairs, crossed a corridor, and then opened another door to this room where they kept all of the leaflets. She went down, she unlocked the door, went in, gathered the leaflets, came out, locked the door, and came back upstairs. And one of our colleagues says, Anne, I think you've locked somebody in that room downstairs. And she says, no, I don't think I have. And she says, yes, you have, I can hear it. And when they went down, they saw the doorknob was rattling. She said, oh, heavens, I've locked somebody in. So she went down and reopened the door. And when she went inside, there was nobody there. All they saw was this rattling door. So it is a very scary place. They say there's they found about 15 ghosts in there. Only one of them, we did some research, only one of them we could recognise, and that was this gentleman. This is the Judge Jeffreys, because upstairs in the Guildhall there's a courtroom. Judge Jeffreys, also known as the hanging judge, he was on the Northern Circuit, so he would have sat in the Guildhall in the courtroom up there at the time. Now, he was known as a hanging judge because of the punishment that he handed out at the trials of the supporters of the Duke of Monmouth. This was down in Dorchester in following the 1685 uprising, when they were trying to overthrow James II and replace him with the Duke of Monmouth. He was furious, and what he did was he pronounced death sentences on 251 251 felons who were supporters of the Duke of Monmouth. Only 74 of them were eventually executed. All of the rest were sent overseas. They were transported overseas. So that's the reason why he's got the name the Hanging Judge. And if you were downstairs in the tourist office, you could hear things upstairs. You could hear when nobody was there. It's not a place that the public can normally get into, and they used to hear things like footsteps or sounds of clanking chains, all sorts. And the sensitives that they had and brought in, they said there were quite a lot of ghostly activity there, but we've never been able to, even though they gave us some names, we've never been able to find out who they are, even though we've done quite extensive research on it. Now, this looks rather strange. This isn't, it's a story that I'm going to tell you about a man called Christopher Chambers. Christopher Chambers advertised himself as a materializing, this isn't Christopher, by the way, we don't have a photograph of him. This is just for illustration purposes. Christopher Chambers was a materializing medium. That's how he advertised himself. And on October 1905, he was at the Spiritualist Institute. That was on Westmoreland Road. And he was going to do a performance where his spirit guide was going to allow him to materialize a person. They charged 2 shillings each, which in 1905 was a lot of money. He charged 2 shillings each to go and see it. He brought with him a huge sort of like a wardrobe or a cupboard with a curtain at the front. All the lights went out, and then as the curtain opened, a gentleman, what supposed to be this materialized, the spirit, came out all dressed in white. Now, Mr. Arthur Neal, he thought that Christopher Chambers was a charlatan. He thought he was a fraud. So he decided he was going to find out. So when he opened the curtain and he stepped out, he turned on the lights. And what he discovered was Mr. Chambers was dressed up in a sheet with a false moustache and also a hat on the head. He looked a bit like an Oriental. And when they went into the cupboard, they found Mr. Chambers' trousers and his socks and his boots sitting on a corner, on a chair, waiting, because he'd obviously got change. He was definitely a fraud, but there were quite a number of them in the country. People were appalled. They had to get they got their 2 shillings back, and it was reported in the local papers. And he said that Mr. Chambers said that his spirit guide couldn't materialize hats and moustaches, so he had to make one to wear. Eventually he went across to Gateshead and he did it again, and he said that he wasn't a fraud, he just needed to do it for the money. So that's the story of Christopher Chambers. But if you do any reading on this, you'll find out there were quite a number of them. This is a very popular thing to do. Spiritualism and seances around this time, around the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, were extremely popular, and people would have people come into their homes to do these seances. It was a way of entertainment. Now, in the Literary and Philosophical Society, they take in many magazines, and I don't mean Hello and OK, but this is one of them. It's a journal for the Society of Psychical Research. They've taken this since 1884, and they've got every single copy. They're down in the basement. They just put each the new one out on show. And it's an interesting thing. I've read it, and there are some stories in here that people have put in, which are linked to the local area, because this is a national magazine. I'm going to tell you the story that I read in one of these. It's a story of a man called Dudley Walker. This is a story about Dudley Walker. Dudley Walker lived in Guildford. He was a young man, lived with his mother and his sister in Guildford. And this is about a dream he had. And this dream was in the 1920s, 1928. He went to bed. This happened between 11 and midnight. And in this dream, he dreamt he was in a signal box. Now, where he worked, it was nothing to do with the railways. You know, he'd never, in fact, he said he wasn't really a dreamer. He didn't often dream. But he said it was a very vivid dream. He was in a signal box. And the signal box was overlooking a railway. And in the dream, he knew he was a signalman, and he knew there was a train coming through. It was an excursion train, and this train was near Darlington, and he pressed all the levers, pulled all the levers to let this train through. The next thing, he's flying above the railway track, and he sees another train coming the opposite way on the same track. There was a massive crash. Both trains were derailed, carriages were overturned, and he was flying along in his dream over the top of the carriages. In one of the carriages, he saw a man being lifted out of the carriage and laying down on the top, and a doctor saying, "Oh, poor man, he's dead." He saw a lot of dead bodies, women and children lying by the side of the track. When he woke up, he was in a right state, and the next morning he couldn't even have his breakfast. And he told his mother the story about his dream, and he said it was just so vivid. He went to work, told his colleagues, and he even wrote it down in his diary. When he left work that night, he saw the placards, and on the placards it said that there's a terrible train crash in Darlington. 23 people were killed, and he bought all the newspapers and took them home. He couldn't believe it. Everything he was reading was what he saw in his dream, even to the fact that it described this man who was lying on the top of a carriage, and the bodies of women lying by the side of the track. He was just really distraught. 23 people actually died. This is the actual train. One of the trains. They've just uprighted it. 23 people have died, 14 of which all came from the same town of Headingley Hall. It was an excursion train. They'd been to Scarborough, and they were on their way back to Newcastle. And this is where the derailment happened. And here's another one. This is part of the goods train that hit it, which was very sad. This apparently has been written quite a lot. There's been a lot written about people who dream things as they're actually happened. And as I say, Dudley had no connection with the railways. You know, he had a job in the city, in the town. Completely different. He hadn't even been to the north of England, and yet he dreamt about this terrible crash. Actually, they thought it might have been human error. They thought it actually might have been the signalman that hadn't changed the track, hadn't changed the points. But the assistant signalman had said that prior to this, he heard a funny noise in the points, and when he did try and change it and he put all of the lights onto red, it was too late, and the crash had actually happened. Now, I'm going to tell you, to finish off, just a few stories about my favourite building, and which is the Lintonville. Lots of ghost stories here, and as Kay will probably know and tell you, they've had Otherworld Northeast to come in and do overnight sittings in here too, and discovered quite a number of ghosts that are lurking about in the rooms. Now, in the basement, sorry, on the ground floor, not the basement yet, on the ground floor is what called a silence room, and this is small little areas where people can go and study. There's Wi-Fi, and you can go down, and they've got bookcases in between, so you're not disturbed. Anyway, one young man decided he wanted to go down and study down in the silence room. He had a look, and there was nobody in, so he knew he had the place to himself. He started to do whatever he did, he's reading his books, etc. And he heard a noise. He heard the noise of pages turning. And he thought, I thought I was the only one here. So he got up out of his chair, wandered round, and there was nobody there. So it is a rather scary place. And there are a couple of other ghosts that you'll find down there. Now up here, this is the music library. And also there's not just the music library, this is a reserve of fiction. There's quite a bit of fiction that can't get into the main part of the library. And there's also a really good map collection at this particular point. But near the door, they discovered there was a rather strange entity when they were doing this this overnight sitting with Otherworld Northeast. And it was the ghost of a man who came to Newcastle at the invitation of the council in 1650 or 1649, sorry. And he was a witch finder. Now, when you think the Lintonville wasn't built until the 1820s, why was somebody who was here nearly 200 years earlier there? But it could have been that because this was built on the garden of a house of the Earls of Westmoreland that was here before the Lintonville was built. It could possibly be when he was invited, he stayed there. We don't know. His name was John Kincaid, and he was a witch finder or a witch pricker because he knew exactly how to find witches. The council had sent out the town crier with his bells, bring out your witches, bring out your witches. So say in the 17th century, witch fever was at its height, and it said, don't suffer a witch to live. And so they decided to round up all these people who they thought were witches, and there were 30 of them. And I've got a painting here to show you. This isn't local. This is a painting of somebody trying to see. This lady here has got a couple of marks on her back. If you've got a funny mark, if you've got a mole on your face, if you've got a black cat, anything like that, they thought you would be a witch. If you sort of dabbled in medicine, if you grew herbs, then they thought you were a witch as well. And they wanted to get rid of all of these witches. So 30 of them were taken to the Guildhall. One of them, fortunately, was known by Lieutenant Hobson. He was the man who was in charge of the trial of these so-called witches, and he knew that this lady that he knew wasn't a witch. And when I say he was a witch pricker, Kincaid, it was the way that he said he could discover witches, and he used this contraption. It was a pin which had a retractable nib, and it went up into this. As you can see from the center here, this is it was like a retractable holder. If you were pricked with a pin and you bled, it meant you weren't a witch. But if you were pricked and you didn't bleed, it meant you were a witch. Well, he knew that by this retracting into the holder, well, it wouldn't draw any blood, so it meant they'd all be witches. But Lieutenant Hodson knew, and he chased Kincaid back to Scotland. But why did he do it, Kincaid? Well, he did it for the money. He was paid 20 shillings per witch, and he denounced or discovered over 200 witches. So he was a rich man. They eventually caught him, and he was, and I think he was hanged. I think he was hanged, or was he burnt at the stake? I'm not quite sure. Sorry, it was one or the other. But it was too late for 15 witches in Newcastle. 15 poor souls. Yeah. They were taken up to the town moor to be hanged. And this is how they were hanged. They put up posts. You had to climb up a ladder. You would put a rope round your neck, and then you were pushed off or turned. They called it turned off the ladder, and then you were hanged. It took quite a long time to die. You didn't die instantly. You were really strangled, and sometimes it took hours for you to die. And then when they were taken down to, this is where it was. If you're wondering where they did the public hanging, it's a blood donor centre car park off Barrack Road. This is where the public hangs were, and Gallows Hall it was called. So this is where they were hanged, and they were taken down from there, and they were taken to St Andrews, where sixpence was paid for the burial of the witches. Each of the witches, before they were buried, stakes were driven through their knees to stop them getting up from their graves and running away. Well, they were witches after all. And the last story I'm going to tell you is this. This is down in the basement of the Lintonville. This is the basement bookstore, where there's lots of really sort of strange activity. My friend Sheila, who's a guide, she was doing some voluntary work down here, and she says all of a sudden she felt the most terrible feelings on her shoulders, and as if something was pressing down. She says she's never worked down there anymore. And one of the librarians, Shima, she'd only been working there for a week, and she was up in the corner to the right of this picture. And then when she looked down, she heard a noise. And you see there are handles on each of the stacks here. And she looked down, and the handles were turning. There was nobody there, and the handles were turning, and the stacks were moving all by themselves. Now, another organisation who did regular overnight sittings here were called Ghost North East. And they brought people down here at night. Now, there's no light source in here. There's no windows, no way that light can get in. There's only one little tiny light, and it's actually on the fire alarm system with a little tiny green light. So they switch everything off, and then you can see what you see. And one lady took a picture of what she saw. And this is in the basement. This is the light, as you can see here. That's the light on the fire alarm. And underneath is a little light at the end of that corridor we saw. I've drawn, there it is. And this is it. It's coming out from the side of the bookshelves. What is it? We don't know. As I say, a little face. You can just see a little face here. And this looks like it's half a body of an entity that's coming out from beside the bookshelves, and that's so that's our evidence of ghosts in the Lintonville. There are other ghosts. There's a Roman soldier often seen in the basement in the room where the boiler is, in the boiler room, and that's because the Lintonville is built over the site of Hadrian's Wall. So we've got Roman soldier who's often seen in there, and lots of other ghosts, and are seen, especially staff tell me that they see odd strange things that happen at night, mainly when everybody's gone home and they're locking up or they're in on their own. Rather strange things that happen there. So if you're in the Lintonville, just be careful that the person standing beside you is not a real person. It might be a ghost. And as Kay said, yes, we probably will be starting the ghost tours of the Lintonville in the autumn. So watch the internet and watch the website when we do start them. And you can have the opportunity to hear more stories about ghostly and grisly tales of Newcastle and Gateshead. Thank you.
Does anybody have any comments or stories of their own that they'd like to share with us?
I do have one about the silence room, actually. It was the first time I was ever in the Lintonville. I went down there to do some work quietly, and I could only stay in there for 5 minutes because it was just so creepy. It freaked me out entirely, and I had to leave. And I just avoid going in there ever since because it's just got a really awful atmosphere.
Has anybody else got any ghostly stories that they want to share with us?
The head ghost hunter as part of Ghost Northeast, Steve, he's hopefully organising some more overnight vigils for late summer into the autumn, but he's too scared to go down to the basement. He won't go down. And he's the head ghost hunter.
But there's a member of staff sits there all the time, isn't there, Kay?
That's right.
And works down there, and she says she hasn't seen anything.
That's right. That's right.
Pat, hi. Well, first of all, thank you. That was absolutely fantastic. Ironically, I live down in Kent now, and I actually drive home from work usually at midnight through what is supposed to be England's most haunted village, which is Pluckley. Has well, depending on what you believe, or if you believe, up to about 15 ghosts. I have to say, sadly, I've never seen anything unusual through there on the journeys. But I was just wondering, do you have any sense yourself of how popular Newcastle and Tyneside was as a destination for the paranormal societies, particularly around the turn of the last century, compared to, say, other parts of the UK? Just thinking about the text that you showed earlier on, and how prominent the Northeast features within that.
Yeah, there were. From what I've read in newspapers, it was quite popular. There was the Spiritualist Institute, as I mentioned, on Westmoreland Road, but people did this in their own houses. It was extremely popular, and there were lots of books written as well about materializing things, or seances, or ectoplasm, and people were extremely interested in it around about this time. Now, how it compares to other parts of the country, I don't know. But I only know about here, and I do know it was extremely, and even today, we've still got, 3 spiritualist churches in the region. There's one in North Shears, there's one in Wallsend, don't know where the other one is, but there are still 3 spiritualist churches, and you can still go and have seances and readings, etc. So it's still going on today. It's the people are still liking it. I've never been myself. I've got to say that I am not a sensitive. I haven't seen anything in any of the buildings, in the Guildhall, in the Lintonville. They're the 2 most haunted places, and I've never felt anything. It's because I'm not a sensitive, and I haven't seen or heard anything. And I don't know whether I'm pleased or not.
Well, certainly when I drive home at midnight, I'm very relieved that I don't see anything driving through that particular village. But thank you for that.
Right, okay. Is that where you're speaking from today, down in
just a few miles away from Pluckley? Yes, yeah.
Oh, right, okay.
Thank you.
Somebody's just mentioned on chat that there's a spiritualist church in Heaton.
Yes, that's it. That was the other one. Yeah, yes. But as I say, I've never been to any of them.
There's one in Philadelphia as well. There's one in Philadelphia as well.
Is there? Yeah. Yeah. Anybody else got anything they'd like to share with us?
Yeah. Sorry. Thanks very much for that as well. I've got a few. They're not really ghost stories, but they're regarding some of the places that you've mentioned.
Yeah.
St. Mary's across on the other opposite side of the Tyne.
Yeah.
Due to me job, I've worked in quite a few of the buildings you've mentioned because I'm a stonemason. So
Oh, right.
I was doing a project on St. Mary's, and it was just after they had found the big cholera pit at the front.
Uh-huh.
And we were knocking the wall through to make the new toilets. And we had to dig down for the foundations. And about 3 feet down, we found it was a young child around about 6 or 7. And the archaeologists had to come and obviously exhume it and stuff. And what they told me was, because the burials were pretty expensive them days, what parents used to do if they couldn't afford the burials was take them across at night and bury them themselves in consecrated ground.
Oh,
So it was right next to the church that we found it. And it was in an unmarked grave.
Right.
And they said that there would be quite a few, probably a little like babies. Most of them would have been babies.
Mm-hmm.
So they wanted them buried in consecrated ground.
Yeah.
The other one was in the morgue. Do you know, on the right-hand side of the swing bridge?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We were working in the opposite building, which is, I think it's a restaurant now. I think it's Sambuca's.
Yeah.
And we had to use that as an office.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't know that it was a morgue. And we had to have our bait times down in the actual morgue part of it. And we were keep complaining that it was freezing cold.
Yeah.
Until the lads went down one bait time, and they said, "Have you ever noticed the door at the end of the bait room?" And we were, "Well, there's not a door there." And they went, "Well, it's open now," and there is a door there. So we all went down, and it was actually open, but we had never noticed it, and there wasn't anybody else in the building at the time.
Wasn't that? Oh.
So that's it. There was it. But I mean, just a few. I'm like, I think it was on Friday. I'm currently in St. Nicholas Cathedral.
Yeah.
In the town. We're doing that out, and there was 2 of us standing on Friday. And what's happened is, if you've got an extension lead where you would think we were standing and it just flew across but it looked as though somebody flew it across the room, but where you're thinking, oh, it's probably plugged in, somebody's pulled the lead. And when we walked over, it wasn't even plugged in, it was all round up.
Was it? Oh.
It's just little things like that. Obviously, working in historical buildings like that, things like that do happen.
You seem to have an interesting job. If you're a stonemason, are you working on anything? What are you working on at present? It's St. Nicholas.
Yeah, St. Nicholas, yeah. I'm going, in a couple of days, I'm going back down to Bishop Auckland Castle, which has got quite a bit of history and obviously quite a few ghost stories to it as well. So the Scottish prisoners being held in them places as well and stuff like that. But it's really interesting to hear, obviously, stories like yourself just tell me. So thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you. Anybody else want to share anything?
Just one thing, Pat, can I clarify something? You know, as I'm studying at the moment. You said John Kincaid. Who was Cuthbert Nicholson? Because wasn't he a Scotch witch finder as well?
There were a few witch prickers in Scotland.
Yeah.
That's what they were called. They called them witch prickers in Scotland. It wasn't Kincaid wasn't the witch finder general. He was he came from the south. But it was Kincaid was the Scottish one. There were quite a few, as I say, in Scotland.
It's just I found a website that mentioned Cuthbert Nicholson in connection with Newcastle, so I put 5 and 7 together and got he was the one that did the witches. So thank you for telling us it was Kincaid and I was wrong.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. I think that's it, Kay.
Well, Pat, thank you so much for that fantastic hour of stories and tales, and I'm sure we'll all sleep soundly tonight. You haven't worried us at all there. Thank you so much on behalf of Lintonville. Thank you on behalf of everybody here tonight. And just to end, really, to say thank you for attending, all of you, much appreciated. This is a free talk, of course, and some of you will already have made a donation to the Lintonville to help us continue our work. So thank you. If you haven't and you would like to contribute, you can find out how to do so on our website or via the information on our YouTube channel. And this talk will be appearing on the YouTube channel in the next couple of days. So thank you again, Pat, and good night, everybody.
Right.
Good night.
Night. Bye.